How's it going, folks? Welcome to another discussion video. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like afterward and share it, as well as give me your feedback in the comments. The focus of this video today is the land of Britain. Now let's get into it. For many across the world, the country of the United Kingdom is inseparable from the British monarchy, which has shaped its destiny and guided the nation for centuries. From creating an empire spanning the globe and changing the history of countless nations, to its role in the creation of English as a global lingua franca, changing the history of the United Kingdom or its monarchy in even the slightest would result in the most profound changes to the timeline of the world. Much thought has been put into alternate history scenarios such as the British Empire surviving or Britain losing the Second World War, all of which make for excellent viewing. However, today I wish to discuss the British Civil Wars of 1639 to 1653, which were a series of conflicts fought across Britain, also known as the English Civil Wars or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. Because the conflicts involved Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and for the sake of brevity and simplicity, this series of conflicts shall henceforth be referred to as the British Civil Wars. Our focus within the conflict will be what may have happened if, during the British Civil Wars of 1639 to 1653, a group of English radicals known as the Levellers had triumphed and taken over Britain. The effects on Britain, its society, and the world as we know it would have been profound. Now let's get into it. Firstly, it is pertinent to establish the background of our what if. Since 927 AD, England had been ruled by various royal dynasties, that is, until the outbreak of the British Civil Wars. The roots of the British Civil Wars lay in the confrontational relationship between the current monarch of the ruling House of Stuart, King Charles I, and England's main legislative body, the English Parliament. The son of King James VI and I, who had united Scotland and England under a personal union, King Charles was a monarch raised believing in the divine right of kings, or the idea that kings were placed on earth by God and ordained to rule in whichever way they saw fit, answering only to God. This attitude was completely incompatible with the English Parliament of the time, who saw it as their right to function independently of the king and be able to put constraints on the monarch if the need ever arose. A major clash between the absolutist monarch and Parliament first occurred in 1625, when the king's government began collecting taxes without parliamentary approval to recoup the government's financial losses following a disastrous military expedition to France. As a result of Parliament's protests, the king imprisoned several members of Parliament in the Tower of London, setting the stage for future conflict between the king and the Parliament. For King Charles, the most expedient solution was simply to dissolve Parliament and rule as an absolute monarch, which he did in 1629. For the next 11 years, King Charles ruled over the Kingdom of England as an absolute monarch without a parliament, in a period known as the Personal Rule. During this time, he collected taxes for himself using legal loopholes. The British Isles during this time were deeply divided along religious lines, and during the era of the Personal Rule, King Charles enacted numerous religious reforms in Protestant England designed to standardize worship in his kingdom, and viewed this standardization as the first step towards creating a church that would fully unify England and Scotland. However, his reforms were viewed as Catholic in nature, and this, alongside his marriage to a Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France, stoked fears in England that King Charles was secretly a Catholic himself. After implementing his reforms in England, in 1637 King Charles replaced the prayer book of the Kirk, or Church, of Scotland, which resulted in riots by Scots infuriated by the king's meddling in their faith. In 1638, many influential Scottish Christians signed the National Covenant, which was a document that voiced its opposition to the new reforms instated by King Charles. Following this, King Charles raised armies in Ireland and England to fight for him and reassert his authority over the people of Scotland, which marked the beginning of the Bishops' Wars, the first conflict of the British Civil Wars. However, the invasion of Scotland was hampered by the royalist factions' overcomplicated plans, nepotism, and low morale. Concurrently, the Scottish forces fighting in support of the National Covenant known as the Covenanters, enjoyed high morale and popular support, as well as the benefit of being under the command of experienced veterans. As a result of the stark discrepancy in the quality of the two armies, King Charles lost the Bishops' Wars to the Scottish Covenanters in 1640. The financial cost of the war was so catastrophic that King Charles was left with no choice but to reconvene Parliament in 1640. When Parliament reconvened, one of their first acts was to execute the first Earl of Strafford, one of King Charles' closest advisors, in spring of 1641, in a show of force against the king. Parliament then made it illegal for the king to impose taxes upon the people without parliamentary approval by closing the loopholes of alternative methods of taxation that were utilized by the king to collect taxes during the era of the personal rule. To make matters worse, amidst rising tensions between the king and Parliament, in autumn 1641, the Irish people rose up against British control of Ireland, and the king and Parliament immediately began arguing over whether the king or the Parliament should oversee the suppression of the Irish rebellion. Soon enough, years of animosity boiled over, and Britain found itself heading for war. After a failed attempt at arresting his foes in Parliament, King Charles, now seen by many as a tyrannical monarch with no respect for checks and balances, fled the capital of London in January 1642, and then raised the royal standard at Nottingham, signaling that he was going to fight Parliament over control of Britain. The First British Civil War began, as the Cavaliers, who were supporters of the king, and the Parliamentarians, who were supporters of Parliament, both raised armies. Furthermore, the Parliamentarians were supported by the Scottish Covenanters. The First British Civil War was a bloody and horrid affair, dividing the nation and resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. After years of bitter fighting, in 1645, the Parliamentarians' professional and well-organized New Model Army, led by Lieutenant General Oliver Cromwell, defeated Royalist Cavalier forces at the Battle of Naseby, and effectively ended any hopes of a Royalist victory in the war. 11 months later, King Charles surrendered to the Scottish Covenanters, and with his capture came the end of the First British Civil War. After the defeat of the Cavaliers, infighting broke out amongst the Parliamentarians, with a power vacuum now existing in Britain. Parliamentarians and the leadership of the New Model Army, known as the Army Council, both competed for influence in post-war England. All parties participated in negotiations with the captured king to some extent, with many hoping to cut a deal with the king and restore peace and order to the land. However, soon enough, King Charles secretly negotiated a deal with the Scottish Covenanters, promising reforms if they were to invade England and restore him to the throne. Thus, in 1648, the Second British Civil War began, with many Scottish Covenanter armies turning against the Parliamentarians and supported by Royalist uprisings in England and Wales. Scottish Covenanters who switched to the king's side were henceforth known as Engagers. However, once more, Parliament and Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army were able to defeat the Royalists, and King Charles' reckless gambit to return himself to power backfired spectacularly. After the end of the Second Civil War, Parliament attempted to return to negotiations with King Charles. However, the Army Council, and New Model Army itself, under the command of Oliver Cromwell, were furious with King Charles' subterfuge and demanded an end to negotiations, branding Charles as a bloody tyrant who needed to be put to death. When Parliament disagreed with the army and planned on continuing negotiations with the king, the Army Council staged a military coup known as Pride's Purge, arresting multiple members of Parliament and leaving Parliament as a fragment of what it once was, now only filled with members of Parliament that Oliver Cromwell and the army felt were sufficiently loyal to them. This parliamentary body would go on to be referred to as the Rump Parliament. Britain was now effectively a military dictatorship led by Oliver Cromwell and the Army Council. After the success of the military coup, the army tried and executed King Charles in January 1649, shocking the world and dividing many in England and the rest of the British Isles. With the death of King Charles I, the Royalist movement benefited from his perceived martyrdom at the hands of Oliver Cromwell and the Army Council. The Covenanters and Irish rebels joined the royalist remnants, now led by the son of King Charles II, in resisting Oliver Cromwell's new military dictatorship. In 1649, Oliver Cromwell landed in Ireland to reconquer it and put down the Irish Rebellion. After a successful campaign in Ireland against the Irish rebels, which was characterized by total warfare and a genocide of the Irish people, Oliver Cromwell departed Ireland in May 1650 to then invade Scotland, where the Royalists and Scottish Covenanters, led by King Charles II, made a final push to oust Cromwell's military government, which ended in failure. After the Royalists lost the Battle of Worcester on September 3, 1651, King Charles II fled to France as Oliver Cromwell cemented his rule over the British Isles as the Lord Protector. With the Royalists defeated, Cromwell returned to England victorious, only to find that the Rump Parliament, now lacking a unifying cause in the Royalist threat, had been consumed by infighting. After several attempts to get Parliament to cooperate and govern, on April 20th, 1653, Oliver Cromwell and his forces stormed the Rump Parliament and dissolved it by force, frustrated by Parliament's complete inability to govern. After one final attempt at instituting a functional Parliament, on the 16th of December 1653, Oliver Cromwell was sworn in as the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, more commonly known as the Protectorate, ruling the nation as a non-royal dictator for life, backed by the power of the new model army. Under the rule of Oliver Cromwell, he summoned a new Parliament of the Protectorate in 1654, only to dismiss them in January 1655 after they attempted to pass reforms to make the military government more republican in nature. After a royalist revolt in 1655, Britain was divided into districts run by military governors, further emphasizing the power of the military in the government. Under Oliver Cromwell, big changes took place in society. While some, such as the resettling of the Jews in England and the modernization of the Navy, were positive, most changes instituted by the Protectorate were negative. These included a drastic uptick in witch trials, banning the celebration of Christmas and Easter, banning people from going to see plays, banning people from working on Sundays, and banning Sunday night football. These bans and new policies were very unpopular across Britain. After nearly 5 years of ruling as Lord Protector, in 1658 Oliver Cromwell became ill with malaria. Because the cure for malaria, quinine, had been brought to Europe by Catholics, Oliver Cromwell refused to take it, which most likely would have saved his life. On September 3, 1658, Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector and military dictator of the British Isles, died aged 59. Following the death of Oliver Cromwell, his inexperienced son, Richard Cromwell, succeeded him as Lord Protector, and the Protectorate rapidly declined without Oliver Cromwell's unifying ruthlessness keeping it together. The army removed Richard Cromwell from power, and soon, pro-royalist forces in Scotland marched to London and reinstated members of Parliament who had been ousted by Pride's Purge back in 1648. On March 16, 1660, Parliament voted to dissolve itself, succeeded by a pro-royalist Parliament, which, on May 8, 1660, declared the exiled King Charles II to be the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. On May 25, 1660, King Charles II arrived in Dover, England, from his exile in the Spanish Netherlands for the first time since he was forced to flee the British Isles nearly a decade prior. King Charles II was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on April 23, 1661. He would rule until his death in 1685. The House of Stuart would rule Britain until the death of Queen Anne in 1714, who was succeeded by the House of Hanover, which would rule Britain until the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, who was then succeeded by the current royal house, the House of Windsor. Between the king's execution, the genocide in Ireland, the military coup of 1648, and the military dictatorship and restoration of the monarchy which followed, the aftermath and legacy of the British Civil Wars is a bit of a mess. The wars marked a seismic shift for British politics and history, yet despite this, at the end of the day, the British monarchy survived, continuing its reign over Britain, along with its classist nature and imperialistic ambitions. Oliver Cromwell's protectorate was just as classist and imperialist as the monarchy, and its restrictions and genocidal tendencies in Ireland have left a permanently black mark on Britain's brief attempt at governing without a monarch. Coupled with the concentration of power within the military, the institutions of the protectorate were destined to fall with the death of Cromwell. It doesn't seem feasible that this dictatorship masquerading as a republic ever could have survived, but this does not necessarily mean that the restoration of the monarchy was inevitable. Enter the Levelers. As political disagreements in Britain spilled over into civil war in the 1640s, the chaos and uncertainty of the era begat the blossoming of radical political ideas amongst the learned citizenry. Amidst this rise of political radicalism in Britain, one group that stood out from the rest was the Levelers. The Leveller movement was a group of political radicals active in the 1640s across Britain, with its biggest support base being London. The Leveller movement began to form organically throughout 1645 and 1646, formally coming into creation in July 1646, when the Levellers led a campaign demanding the release of political activist John Lilburne, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London at that time. Soon after the campaign for his release, John Lilburne, more commonly known as Freeborn John, due to his firm belief that men were born with certain unalienable rights and thus born free, emerged as the leader and public face of the Leveller movement. A biblically inspired radical movement that was revolutionary for its time, the Levelers espoused and promoted ideas of religious freedom, the equality of all men, natural rights, individual sovereignty, and limited government, comprised of separated powers and based on the consent of the governed. In the aftermath of the parliamentarian victory in the Civil War and the execution of King Charles I, the English Parliament and army leadership both rose to power as major political forces and found themselves opened up to increased scrutiny. As these developments occurred, the first Leveller publications began to appear in England. In these early publications, anonymous authors decried current parliamentary leadership as more tyrannical than Charles I ever was, and therefore no longer representative of the people of Britain. In 1647's The First Agreement of the People, the Levellers chastised Parliament for gerrymandering to remain in power, as well as calling for Parliament's dissolution and for new elections to be held in Britain. The aftermath of the Civil War, characterized by parliamentary rule and the rise of the New Model Army, was a major factor in the creation of the Levellers, and the political influence of the Leveller movement was not only limited to the intellectuals of London. Upon the parliamentarian victory in the First British Civil War, the New Model Army became increasingly influential, both as a military force and a political one. The New Model Army's politics were often not in sync with those of Parliament or the army leadership, also known as the Army Grandees, and the politicized military was fertile ground for the dissemination of radical ideas. The Army's potential for radicalization was demonstrated by the fact that close links between the Leveller movement and the Army's regimental representatives enabled the Levellers, and especially Freeborn John himself, to exert a considerable influence over the New Model Army by 1647. One key cause of the Levellers' innate popularity in the New Model Army was mainly due to the fact that they advocated for the immediate payment of money owed to the soldiers of the New Model Army, as well as securing future funding for the institutions of the Army. Another key factor in the Levellers gaining influence within the Army was their written works. In fact, the first draft of the seminal Leveller Manifesto, commonly known as the First Agreement of the People, was first presented at a meeting of the General Council of the New Model Army. The Levellers have long fascinated me because they are a bit of an anachronism, especially in their resemblance to the founding fathers of the United States 130 years later. The group envisioned Britain under the regime of liberal democracy and fought for freedom of religion, land reform, and for the working people of Britain. The Leveller ideology, while very similar to modern political ideals, was alien to 1640s Britain. The Levellers' advocacy for the creation of a democratic republic in Britain encompassed many different ideals. Some major pillars of their beliefs are as follows. The Levellers believed in religious freedom and wished to implement a separation of church and state, removing the Church of England from its position of power and allowing every man and woman to worship God in whichever way they felt best. The Levellers believed that every human being is born equal to one another, and that no man should have power over the rights and liberties of another. The Levelers held that all men were born to enjoy liberty, freedom, and the right to own property and have a voice in their government. They held that these freedoms were a gift from God himself, and that no man had any right to take from another what God had given to everyone. The Levelers believed that the ideal government was one formed with the consent of those it sought to govern, that every law passed should not be a decree, but a mutual contract amongst the people, enacted at their behest and to their benefit. They called for a drastic restructuring of Britain's government, tearing down the old feudalistic and tyrannical ways to pave the way for a liberal democracy along with regular elections. The Levelers believed that England's Parliament, as it had existed prior, was in need of reform. The English Parliament was divided into two houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which persist to modern day. The House of Lords was composed of religious figures and nobility, who served for life and were appointed by the king. The House of Commons, on the other hand, was originally formed by ordinary people coming to parliamentary meetings to represent their area. The Levelers wished to abolish the House of Lords and have the House of Commons be the sole legislative branch of the government. The Levelers opposed any form of privileges or special treatment for any one person, believing all people to be equal under the law. They believed that every trial should be conducted according to a standardized procedure to ensure that every accused individual received a fair trial. The Levelers were in complete opposition to the institution of slavery. The Levelers also opposed the act of declaring war without a national vote by the people to agree to partake in the conflict. The Levelers opposed censorship and restrictions on freedom of expression. The Levelers demanded the creation of fair voting districts based on giving the people a voice rather than guaranteeing victory for a specific politician, as well as stiffer penalties for misconduct, embezzlement, and corruption by members of Parliament and other branches of government. Quite a few members of Parliament also worked within the Treasury, which enabled easy corruption as long as both institutions were run by the same people. The Levelers spoke out against this practice and called for banning representatives from working in the Treasury and vice versa. The Levelers believed that the key to preventing conflicts of interest amongst those in power was a system of checks and balances. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, summed up for the purposes of this video. All of these ideas terrified the army leadership, Parliament, and royalists equally. Even worse than their ideas was the popularity the Levelers enjoyed. Freeborn John worked tirelessly to spread their message through debates, dissemination of Leveler writings, and public petitions, which electrified many across Britain and endangered the status quo. Indeed, as a variety of people in England hadn't seen any actual change in their lives following the war, this caused many to seek real, meaningful change elsewhere, and it allowed the Levelers to answer that call. The Levelers found themselves very much supported by England's downtrodden and oppressed classes. In an era where women were largely shut out of public life, in the Leveler movement, the women of England were given a chance to participate in politics. The support of the women of England was undoubtedly linked to the Levelers' belief in the equality of all human beings, and in fact, the first ever all-female petition to Parliament was actually in support of the Levelers. In an era where England's poor were treated as less than, the Leveler movement frequently invoked the myth of a golden age pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon state, replete with the ideals of an egalitarian and classical republican government, in sharp contrast to modern England, which was rife with inequity. Prominent Leveler Richard Overton called for land reform across Britain because of the simple fact that human beings had a natural birthright to own the land they worked on. The Levelers' call for land redistribution undermined the entire system of exploitation that both King Charles and Oliver Cromwell's dictatorship were founded on. Because the implementation of the Levelers' plan for Britain would result in the complete destruction of their way of life, Britain's elite, regardless of which side they'd taken in the civil wars, condemned the Levelers. In fact, the Levelers themselves often called themselves agitators, and the name Leveler came from their opponents, who spread propaganda that the Levelers were out to tear down every man and his achievements, thus leveling men's estates and forcing everyone to be equal. Of course, this only applied to the nobility and army leadership, but that part was omitted. Oliver Cromwell was spurred to action as the movement's growth began to threaten his rule. In 1647, the army grandees and the rank-and-file soldiers of the New Model Army met in Putney, wherein the Putney debates were held about what type of government should be installed following the defeat of the Royalists. While the army grandees advocated for a governing document termed the Heads of Proposals, the levelers advocated that their agreement of the people be the basis for a new government. The debates continued until the army grandees suspended the talks in November 1647. While only supposed to be temporary, in the days following the suspension of the debate, King Charles escaped parliamentarian custody and began planning the Second British Civil War. Amidst the chaos, Oliver Cromwell and the army grandees enforced a new rule that the new model army sign loyalty oaths to the grandees, effectively ending any real chance to discuss change within the army and country as a whole. Following this, tensions between the pro-leveler rank-and-file and pro-Cromwell army grandees skyrocketed. Between 1647 and 1649, there were 3 separate mutinies in the New Model Army by soldiers who had been inspired by the ideals of the levelers, all of which had to be put down by force. Fed up with the levelers, Oliver Cromwell began an effort to systematically crush the movement before things got out of hand. By 1649, many prominent levelers in the New Model Army had been discharged or executed, and many more civilian levelers had been imprisoned, including Freeborn John, who was banished to the Netherlands in 1652. By 1650, Britain's best hope for democratic rule had been destroyed by Oliver Cromwell, ensuring the eventual restoration of the monarchy following his dictatorial and unpopular rule. But the sad history of the levelers' fight for hope and freedom was not written in stone. What if, in an alternate universe, the levelers had, against all odds, fought and won Britain's freedom from all tyranny? Let's find out. Our point of divergence will be the first leveler-backed army mutiny following the Putney debates. Now, the Putney debates still take place as in our timeline, but unlike in our timeline, leveler leaders Richard Overton and John Lilburne, who were imprisoned during the debates in our timeline, are instead not imprisoned and are thus present to present the levelers' argument. The charismatic articulation of their ideals wins over more support from the army grandees than in our timeline, although the levelers still lack enough support to outright win the Putney debates. On November 15, 1647, just as in our timeline, the Cork-Bush Field Mutiny occurs. The New Model Army's leadership, concerned over growing leveler influence amongst the common soldiers, attempt to force every soldier to sign a declaration of loyalty to Sir Thomas Fairfax, the Army's commander-in-chief, and the Army Council itself. This, in effect, legally requires any soldier who'd signed the oath to obey the orders of Oliver Cromwell and the army grandees, even over Parliament's orders. In our timeline, many men, even levelers, signed the oaths believing that they would be given their owed back pay, even though they were never paid afterward. However, some soldiers and officers refused to sign and were actually placed under arrest by Sir Thomas Fairfax. Just then, 2 regiments arrive, unannounced, with copies of the Agreement of the People, and a 3rd regiment, commanded by leveler Robert Lilburne, brother of Freeborn John, arrives soon after, in hopes of creating an organized resistance to the army grandees' attempts at silencing dissent in the army. Tensions flare as the rebels arrive with pieces of paper in their hatbands reading "England's freedom, soldiers' rights," and the army grandees order them to remove the radical slogans from their uniforms at once. Further worsening tensions is the fact that the rebellious soldiers begin distributing leveler pamphlets to Oliver Cromwell's soldiers and tell them the truth about the deceptive loyalty oaths. Unlike in our timeline, where Robert Lilburne was not actually present to command his regiment, in this alternate timeline he is. Robert Lilburne manages to formally organize the dissenters into a united front against the grandees' political maneuvering. When an officer of Sir Thomas Fairfax rides to the regiments with orders to remove their inflammatory slogans, Robert Lilburne, speaking for the rebels, replies with a resounding no. The officer, infuriated by Lilburne's defiance, reaches for his firearm. Before he is able to shoot Colonel Lilburne, the colonel instead shoots the officer. As the shot rings out and the officer falls from his horse, Colonel Lilburne realizes that the life he once knew was over. As what has transpired registers with all present, Colonel Lilburne rallies the rebel regiments to stay the course and fight alongside him. In our timeline, Oliver Cromwell suppressed a mutiny at Cork-Bush Field. But in this alternate timeline, the Battle of Cork-Bush Field has begun. While the army leadership commands 7 battalions, the rebels only command 3. With these numbers, Colonel Lilburn understands that he is at a significant disadvantage, and as soon as the battle begins, he orders the rebels to begin a tactical retreat, knowing that they cannot currently defeat Cromwell's forces. While the rebel battalions risk being completely annihilated by Cromwell's superior forces, the tide of the battle shifts, as one of Cromwell's battalions, outraged by his deception, defects to the side of the rebels. The defection catches the army off guard and successfully allows the rebels to retreat and live to fight another day. The Battle of Corkbush Field marked the definitive creation of the Levellers as a faction of the British Civil Wars. After mutinying, rebel forces at Corkbush Field managed to engage in a tactical retreat, evading pursuing parliamentarian forces due to their smaller size. This action is later known as the Flight to Anglesey. After narrowly surviving the Battle of Corkbush Field, Colonel Lilburn and the rebels are on the run. Lilburn dispatches a loyal soldier southward to London to inform his brother, Freeborn John, of what has transpired. Within the day, Freeborn John is informed of what has happened at Corkbush Field and calls an emergency meeting of the Levellers. The Leveller leadership reaches an agreement on how to proceed going forward. Any surrender to the forces of Cromwell will result in certain death for the rebels. Accordingly, the Levellers vow to never surrender. Instead, Freeborn John relays his plans to his brother's messenger. Wales, a bastion of royalist sentiment and fiercely anti-Cromwell, represents the best chance for survival for the rebels currently. Freeborn John suggests that his brother and the rebels flee into exile in Wales temporarily while plans are made on what to do with them. Freeborn John and the Levellers also predict that following the Battle of Corkbush Field, Cromwell and Parliament will be spooked of their radical ideas, more so than already, and will crack down harshly on their activities. Accordingly, Leveller activities are curtailed as the movement goes underground and shifts its priorities from urban outreach to rural outreach. To the Levellers' advantage is their highly developed network of contacts throughout Britain, which allows them to continue to spread their ideas even in such a time as this. After receiving his brother's message, Colonel Robert Lilburn, in consultation with his fellow rebel officers, makes the decision to flee to Wales, which represents their best chance for survival and to recover and gather their strength. As the rebels continue their retreat westward, Cromwell dispatches soldiers in an attempt to crush the rebellion for good. Unfortunately for him, the rebels, fighting for their lives, triumph over Cromwell's unpaid soldiers, suffering from low morale and an outbreak of bubonic plague. After a few days, the rebel forces reach their new home on Anglesey, at least for now. Chosen for its remote location and proximity to the anti-parliamentarian Irish Confederacy, the Isle of Anglesey is invaded and conquered by the rebels following brief fighting with the garrison placed there by Oliver Cromwell. In the following centuries, the capture of the Isle of Anglesey, later termed the Liberation of Anglesey, would be seen as a pivotal moment in the history of Britain. While the rebels begin to fortify the island, Colonel Robert Lilburn takes power as the leader of the rebels after a vote is held amongst his troops. His early tenure is defined by his frequent usage of scouts and couriers to pass information to his brother in London. Within London and the other major cities of Britain, a massive crackdown on the Leveller movement has begun following the Battle of Corkbush Field. Determined to avoid capture and continue their movement, the Levellers begin coordinating a mass migration to Wales to join the rebels at Anglesey. The first group of these Leveller refugees is led by Gerard Winstanley, who arrives at Anglesey on December 1st, 1647. Winstanley's presence at Anglesey is a testament to the strength of the movement's messaging even after the Corkbush Field incident. Winstanley, a cowherd in Surrey, had been inspired to join the cause following the rebellion at Corkbush Field. From reading the Levellers' pamphlets, Gerard Winstanley saw that God had given the world to everyone, that poverty was ungodly, and that people should utilize the unused lands of the nobility to provide for their community. A wise and charismatic orator, Winstanley soon takes prominence in the political circles of Holyhead, the largest city on the Isle of Anglesey. However, Winstanley's group was merely the first. As the persecution of the Levellers intensifies in England, more and more flee to join Colonel Lilburn's forces in Anglesey. Colonel Lilburn begins to enact sweeping reforms across the island, including the confiscation of property from wealthy landowners, redistributing it to the peasants who worked the land. As the year 1647 comes to a close, Oliver Cromwell in Parliament, remained preoccupied with the ongoing negotiations with King Charles. However, this abruptly ends on November 11, 1647, when King Charles manages to escape parliamentarian custody and flee to Scotland. Following this, a decision is reached within the Army Council to put the search for the rebels on hold and focus on keeping the security situation in England stable, as the clouds of war had begun to loom once more. Although many in the army and in Parliament believed that the Leveller movement had been suppressed, it had begun to grow even larger than in our timeline, as Freeborn John and the other Leveller leaders worked tirelessly to spread their message of democracy and equality across war-torn Britain. Through correspondence with his brother, Freeborn John and Colonel Lilburne had reached the conclusion that with the Leveller movement banned, all diplomatic forms of recourse for their movement had been closed to them. The brothers, in coordination with the other Leveller leaders, made the decision to begin fighting for democracy, both with the pen and the sword. And that is where we will leave off for today. This is merely part 1 of a continuing story. If you like the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Part 2 will be coming soon.